Camille Claudel, born in 1864 and died in 1943, forgotten by everyone in a mental hospital. What had she done? She came to study in Paris at a time when the fine arts school was open only to men. That's why she took lessons in artist studios that accepted women. There, she met and became the lover of the most famous sculptor of the time, Auguste Rodin. Their relationship was both passionate and artistic. They worked and sculpted together. The Rodin Museum and the Orsay Museum preserve beautiful works from this era. Then he left her, having lived with another woman for years. The artist, loved and respected by all. She was denigrated, abandoned, and even marginalized artistically. She lived alone, no longer trusted anyone, and her works were not for sale. Additionally, his brother was the famous poet, writer, diplomat, and academic Paul Claudel. The family decided to internate her, viewing this woman as too modern for the time and an embarrassment to the household. We have letters she wrote to friends and family seeking help. For 30 years, she tried to explain to hospital staff the injustice she was experiencing. These are heart-wrenching testimonies that reveal the lucidity of the woman in the hospital. She practically starved to death on October 19, 1943, in a French public hospital, and no family member attended her funeral. Her remains were laid in a common grave. Today, the legacy of Camille Claudel has been completely rehabilitated. Her works are exhibited next to Rodin's, and a museum a few kilometers from Paris is entirely dedicated to her. Dennis Bowman and his wife Brenda decided to start a family together in 1976. They adopted a baby girl, who they renamed Andrea Michelle. All was well, or so it seemed, until May of 1980. Dennis had run a girl off the road on her bike and then demanded she go into the woods, shooting at her when she didn't comply. He pled guilty to assist with intent to commit criminal sexual conduct and sentenced to 5 to 10 years. In 1988, his daughter Andrea began accusing him of molesting her, but her complaints fell on deaf ears. She had even told her mother Brenda, but she told Andrea she was lying. In March of 1989, Andrea went missing. In March of 1998, Dennis broke into a co-worker's home and stole pieces of her lingerie. He was charged with breaking and entering and got a year in jail. All was quiet until 2019, when he was arrested at 70 years old for the 1980 murder of Kathleen Doyle. He would eventually confess to killing his daughter Andrea and burying her body in their backyard. Andrea's remains were discovered in 2020. Dennis pled guilty to Kathleen's murder, getting to life sentences without parole plus 20 years. He pled no contest to Andrea's murder and received 35 to 50 years. Dennis also confessed to a 1978 attack on another woman. He said he broke into her home, bound and gagged her, then sexually assaulted her before fleeing. He was never changed in this case. Andrea's birth mom, Kathy, who calls Andrea by her birth name Alexis, is trying to get custody of her remains and is active on her Justice for Andrea FB page. Dennis is suspected to possibly have ties to a couple other murders, as well as abductions and attempted abductions of children as young as 6 years old. 24-year-old Erin Marie Gilbert had only lived in Alaska for a year before mysteriously vanishing. In 1994, Erin moved from the continental U.S. to the state to be with her family and pursue cosmetology school, hoping to enroll in the class of 1995. On July 1, 1995, Erin met with David Combs for a date that would change her life. The pair visited the Girdwood Forest for the Forest Annual Fair. Erin had met David the night before at a bar and wanted to get to know him better. At 6 p.m. the pair returned to David's car when he realized something was wrong. He had left his lights running the entire time and the battery was flat. In his statement, David said he left Erin at the car near a tree line to walk to his friend's home for help. For the next 2 hours, David walked around Girdwood looking for his friend's home, but could not find it. When he returned to his car, Erin was gone. As if by magic, his car was now running, along with the lights. David searched the forest until 1 a.m. when he retired home. At 7 a.m. the next morning, David called Erin's sister, whom she lived with, to speak with her, but he was informed she had failed to return home. The pair immediately rushed to Girdwood Forest to look for Erin, with festival organizers announcing her name and employing the help of others. The Alaska State Troopers were also summoned and used a variety of methods to locate her. Unfortunately, no sign of Erin was ever found and her case remains at the same place today. Despite being the last person to see Erin, investigators do not consider David a suspect in her sudden disappearance. Since 1995, numerous searches have been conducted, but nothing of note was ever found. Erin Marie Gilbert is a white female with brown hair, hazel eyes, 5 feet 11 inches and 145 pounds. She has a large blue flower tattooed on her chest. If still alive today, Erin would be 53 years old. Foul play is suspected in Erin's case. To 10-year-old boys, Robert Thompson and John Venables abducted, tortured, and murdered a 2-year-old boy. James Patrick Bulger, the 16th of March 1990. Thompson and Venables led Bulger away from the New Strand shopping center in Bootle after his mother had taken her eyes off him momentarily. His mutilated body was found on a railway line 2.5 miles away in Walton, Liverpool. 2 days later, Thompson and Venables were charged on the 20th of February 1993 with abduction and murder. They were found guilty on the 24th of November, making them the youngest convicted murderers in modern British history. They were sentenced to indefinite detention at Her Majesty's pleasure and remained in custody until a parole board decision in June 2001 recommended their release on a lifelong license at age 18. Venables was sent to prison in 2010 for breaching the terms of his license, was released on parole again in 2013, and in November 2017 was again sent to prison for possessing child sexual abuse images on his computer. He remained in prison in 2023 after his appeals for parole were rejected. The Bulger case has prompted widespread debate about how to handle young offenders when they are sentenced or released from custody. CCTV at the New Strand Shopping Center in Bootle on the 12th of February 1993 showed Thompson and Venables casually observing children, apparently selecting a target. The boys were playing truant from their local primary school, which they did regularly. Throughout the day, Thompson and Venables were seen shoplifting various items, including sweets, batteries, a troll doll, and a can of blue Humbrol modeling paint. One of the boys later said that before abducting Bulger, they were planning to abduct a child, lead him to the busy road alongside the shopping center, and push him into the oncoming traffic. That same afternoon, 2-year-old James Patrick Bulger, from Kirkby, went with his mother, Denise, to the New Strand Shopping Center. While inside the AR Times butcher's shop on the lower floor of the center at around 1540, Denise, who had let go of her son's hand to pay for her shopping, realized that her son was missing. Thompson and Venables took Bulger to the Leeds in Liverpool Canal, round 1 mile from the New Strand Shopping Center, where they dropped him on his head, and he suffered injuries to his face. The boys joked about pushing Bulger into the canal. An eyewitness said that when he saw Bulger at the canal, the boy was crying his eyes out. The boys went on a 12-mile walk across Liverpool. They were seen by around 38 people, but most bystanders did nothing to intervene. 2 people confronted Thompson and Venables, but they either claimed that Bulger was their brother or that he was lost, and that they were taking him to a police station. At one point, the boys took Bulger into a pet shop, from which they were ejected. Eventually, the boys arrived in Walton. With Walton Lane Police Station across the road, they hesitated, then led Bulger up a steep bank to a railway line near the former Walton and Anfield railway station, close to Walton Park Cemetery. One of the boys threw the blue paint that they had shoplifted earlier into Bulger's left eye. They kicked him, stamped on him, and threw bricks and stones at him. They placed batteries in Bulger's mouth and may have inserted some into his anus. Although none were found there finally, the boys dropped a 10 kilograms railway fish plate on Bulger. He sustained 10 skull fractures as a result of the bar striking his head. Pathologist Alan Williams stated that Bulger suffered so many injuries, 42 in total, that none could be identified as the fatal blow. Thompson and Venables laid Bulger across the railway tracks and weighted his head down with rubble, hoping that a train would hit him and his death would be ruled an accident. After they left the scene, his body was cut in half by a train. Bulger's severed body was discovered by 4 boys 2 days later. A forensic pathologist testified that Bulger died before he was struck by the train. Police suspected that the boys had sexually assaulted Bulger as his shoes, socks, trousers, and underpants had been removed. The pathologist's report, which was read out in court, found that Bulger's foreskin had been forcibly pulled back. When Thompson and Venables were questioned about this aspect of the attack by detectives and a child psychiatrist, Eileen Vizard, the pair were reluctant to give details. When Venables was let out on parole, his psychiatrist, Susan Bailey, reported that visiting and revisiting the issue with John as a child, and now as an adolescent, he gives no account of any sexual element to the offense. The police quickly found low-resolution video images of 2 unidentified boys abducting Bulger from the New Strand Shopping Center. The railway embankment upon which his body had been discovered was soon adorned with hundreds of bunches of flowers. The family of one boy, who was detained for questioning but subsequently released, had to flee the city due to threats from vigilantes. The breakthrough came when a woman, upon seeing slightly enhanced images of the 2 boys on national television, recognized Venables and remembered seeing him playing truant with Thompson in the Bootle area that day. She contacted the police, and the boys were arrested. Dina Thompson, commonly known as the Black Widow, is a British convicted murderer, confidence trickster and bigamist who is also suspected of having killed a second individual. She habitually met men through Lonely Hearts columns and stole their money. She was imprisoned for murdering former media manager Gillian Webb, her second husband, though she was still married to her first. She had previously been acquitted of the attempted murder of her next husband Richard Thompson, whom she married in 1998 after her divorce, having attacked him with a baseball bat and a knife, but being cleared on the grounds of self-defense. Despite her acquittal for the attempted murder of Thompson, police became suspicious of the circumstances in which previous husband Webb had died, and after Webb's remains were exhumed and analyzed, she was convicted of murder and sentenced to life imprisonment. A high court ruling in 2007 determined she would serve 16 years, meaning she would not be eligible for release until 2019. She was also convicted of theft and defrauding former lovers. Following her 2003 conviction, Detective Chief Inspector Martin Underhill stated, "This woman is every man's nightmare, the most dangerous woman I have ever met. For a decade, she has targeted men sexually, financially and physically. The men of Britain can sleep safe tonight knowing she has been taken off the streets." A judge described her as one of the most fluent liars I have come across. Detective Chief Inspector Martin Underhill observed Thompson was a misandrist. "I think the events of her childhood have made her hate men. If you look at her life, it is always men she has targeted." After her murder conviction, it was revealed that police were investigating the suspicious disappearance of a previous partner she had in Bulgaria, who has never been found. As of May 2022, Thompson was being held in an open prison with day release provisions. Thompson was granted release on parole in May 2022 and was released in June. Despite her acquittal for attempted murder, investigating officers had grown suspicious of the circumstances of the death of Thompson's second husband, Gillian Webb. 6 years previously, they announced that they would be exhuming Webb's body, which was done in October 2001. A friend of Thompson's came forward to tell police that she had indicated to him that she had given the overdose of drugs to her husband in a hot curry. In 2003, Thompson was convicted of Webb's murder after a trial at the Old Bailey and sentenced to life. She was told her sentence would run to 16 years at a 2007 High Court ruling, meaning she would not be eligible for release until 2019. The judge at her 2003 trial described her as utterly ruthless and without pity. She was dubbed the Black Widow in the press, as a Black Widow spider will kill their male counterparts after mating with them. As of 2016, Thompson was imprisoned in HM Prison Send, but she became eligible for parole in 2019. Following her 2003 conviction, it was reported that Thompson was being investigated about the disappearance of another of her previous partners, Stoyan Kostov. Investigators had tried to trace all of Thompson's former lovers in order to establish if she had committed potentially criminal acts against further victims, stating we cannot rule out the possibility that other partners have been injured in some way. Was discovered that Kostov, whom she dated in the 1970s and 1980s, had been missing since he had dated Thompson while she was training as a gymnast in Bulgaria. In 2010, media interest was renewed in the disappearance after a new probe was launched, with investigators stating that some sort of incident seems to have happened in Bulgaria, but we don't know what it was. As of 2021, Kostov had never been found.
The 12th of February 1936. Warm blankets and warm milk for pupils at the open-air school in St. James's Park, London. St. James's Park Open Air School was set up to restore children to health and strength through fresh air, rest, exercise, and nourishing food. Tuberculosis and malnutrition were rife in the early years of the 20th century when thousands of sick children were unable to attend school. The belief that children needed to be schooled outdoors to hold back the ravages of TB.
Mary Ann Britland died in 1886. She was an English serial killer. She was the first woman to be executed by hanging at Strangeways Prison in Manchester by James Berry. In February 1886, Britland went to a nearby chemist's and, claiming to have had some mice infest her home, bought some packets of Harrison's vermin killer. As this contained both strychnine and arsenic, she was required to sign the poison register. Britland's first victim was her eldest daughter, 19-year-old Elizabeth Hannah, in March 1886. Elizabeth's death was attributed to natural causes by the doctor who was called to attend the teenager. Mary Ann Britland then claimed £10 on Elizabeth's life insurance policy. Her next victim was her husband, Thomas, aged 44. His death on 3 May was diagnosed as epilepsy, and once again Mary Ann claimed on the insurance. Mary Ann had been having an affair with her neighbour, Thomas Dixon, and after her own husband's death, was invited to stay at the Dixons' house just across the street at number 128 by Thomas's 29-year-old wife, Mary. On 14 May, Mary Dixon was to become Britland's third and final victim. The three deaths, all with their near-identical and somewhat unusual symptoms, raised suspicion. Mary Ann Britland was finally interviewed by the police in connection with Mary Dixon's death, and her body was examined by a pathologist. It was found to contain a lethal quantity of the two poisons, and Britland was immediately arrested along with Thomas Dixon. She confessed to Ashton police that she had wanted to marry Dixon and that she had first poisoned her daughter, Elizabeth, because she believed that she suspected her intentions. She then killed her husband and finally married Dixon. Britland was charged with the murder of the three victims, but Thomas Dixon was found to have played no part in the murder of his wife. Since there was an absence of motive, in her defense, she argued that the small sum of money from the insurance payouts was in no way compensation for the loss of her husband and daughter. It took the jury some time to convict her, although eventually they found her guilty. After she was sentenced, she declared to the court, "I am quite innocent, I am not guilty at all." On the morning of August 9, 1886, Britland was in a state of collapse and had to be heavily assisted to the gallows by two female wardens. Britland was screaming and asking for mercy. The women held her on the trapdoors while James Berry prepared her for execution. Two male wardens then took the place of the female wardens. On a signal from the executioner, they quickly stepped back, the trapdoor was released and Britland dropped. She was the first woman to be executed at Strangeways Prison in Manchester. The prison was open to male and female prisoners until 1963, when the facility became male only.
Originally, the prison contained an execution shed in B Wing, and after World War I, a special execution room and cell for the condemned criminal was built. Strangeways was one of the few prisons to have permanent gallows. The first execution at Strangeways was that of 20-year-old murderer Michael Johnson, who was hanged by William Calcraft on the 29th of March 1869. 29 hangings took place over the next 20 years and 71 took place in the 20th century, bringing the total number to 100. During the second half of the century, the number of executions decreased, with no hangings between 1954 and the 28th of November 1962, when James Smith was executed. John Robson Walby, one of the last people to be hanged in England, was executed here on the 13th of August 1964. Out of the 100 hangings, 4 were double hangings, while the rest were done individually. The quickest hanging of James Inglis in 7 seconds, carried out by Albert Pierrepoint, took place here. Louisa May Merrifield was hung in 1953, was a British murderer and the third last woman to be hanged in the United Kingdom. She was executed by Albert Pierrepoint at Strangeways Prison in Manchester for poisoning her elderly employer. She was notorious at the time as the Blackpool Poisoner. Born in Wigan in Lancashire as Louisa May Highway, she was the youngest of 5 surviving daughters and 2 sons of Job Highway, an underground laborer in a coal mine, and Emma Duncan. By the time of her execution, Merrifield had been married 3 times. She married her first husband, Joseph Ellison, in 1931, and with him had 6 children. Ernest and Ellison died in infancy. She lost custody of all 4 of her surviving 2 daughters and 2 sons when she was sent to prison for 84 days in 1946, having been found guilty of ration book fraud and refusing to pay the £10 fine. Joseph Ellison died in 1949, aged 44, owing to subacute infective hepatitis. Merrifield subsequently married 78-year-old Richard Weston on the 6th of February 1950. He died 10 weeks later of a heart attack. 2 of her husbands were much older men, and she had been married 3 times in 10 months. From 1950 up to the time of the murder, Merrifield had some 20 jobs working as a domestic helper and housekeeper. She had been frequently fired or forced to leave owing to her poor attitude to her work and her alleged pilfering.
On the 22nd of August 1950, she married her 3rd husband, 68-year-old widower Alfred Edward Merrifield, whose first wife Alice Whittle had died in 1949. He had abandoned her and their 10 children in 1928. On the 12th of March 1953, the couple were employed as housekeeper, handyman and live-in companions to 79-year-old Sarian Ricketts. Ricketts lived in her bungalow at 339 Devonshire Road in Blackpool. Ricketts was a widow, whose two husbands had both committed suicide by gassing themselves in the kitchen. Despite her diminutive height, she was only 4'8". Ricketts was a difficult woman with a short temper. Ricketts had a habit of changing her will whenever a beneficiary annoyed or upset her, which was often. Soon after the Merrifields took up their jobs, Ricketts was complaining about their lack of care towards her, the shortage of food, and that they were spending a lot of her money in the local public houses, where Louisa drank excessively and habitually became severely inebriated. Louisa Merrifield was a liar and a braggart, who had a loose tongue when under the influence of alcohol. She preferred to spend her time in the pubs of Blackpool rather than take care of her employer. She began to brag that Mrs. Ricketts was dead and had left her the bungalow. Even though the old woman was still very much alive, it was becoming apparent to Louisa Merrifield that her elderly husband Woe had not been able to support her financially for much longer. By late March 1953, Merrifield had talked Mrs. Ricketts into writing a will that left the bungalow to her. The bungalow was valued at £3,000 to £4,000. On the complaint of Alfred Merrifield that he was not included in the will, he was assigned half of the property. On the 9th of April, Louisa Merrifield convinced Trivial Mrs. Ricketts' physician to certify that Ricketts was mentally competent to make a new will. Trivial later stated, "She Merrifield said the reason why she wanted me to go was that the old lady might die at any minute with a stroke or a disease, and she wanted to keep herself all right with the relatives." On the 13th of April, Dr. Yule's partner Dr. Albert Victor Wood was called out by Merrifield. She stated that Ricketts was seriously ill, whereas Wood merely diagnosed mild bronchitis. He later testified at Merrifield's trial, "I remonstrated with Mrs. Merrifield for calling me out, as I thought, under false pretenses. She again said she was afraid of something happening during the night. Mrs. Merrifield mentioned something about a will. I said I wasn't interested." Although this evidence is only circumstantial, it does lead to the conclusion that Merrifield was already trying to prove that the elderly Mrs. Ricketts was dying of natural causes.